The German shepherd froze, one paw suspended in midair, ears perked toward the windless ruins ahead. Zeus didn't growl, didn't bark. He just stared, locked in place, at a crumbling orphanage that hadn't housed a soul in over 30 years. Deputy Grace Lawson felt the air shift too. Cold, still, and wrong. Somewhere deep inside Oak Ridge House for Children, something had waited a long time to be found. And now, it had a scent. Oak Ridge, Oregon was the kind of town where strangers stuck out. Local news came from the church bulletin, and most dogs were friendly enough to run leash-free. The old-timers talked more about logging days and county fairs than crime reports. But ever since Zeus came to live with Grace, after 2 tours in Afghanistan and a shrapnel wound that should have retired him, things in Willow Creek County hadn't been quiet. It started with the urban explorer. Grace had just sat down at her desk, halfway through her first cup of bitter morning brew, when a skinny kid with dirt under his fingernails and too many zippers on his backpack walked through the sheriff's office doors. His flannel shirt hung off him like a scarecrow, and his eyes darted like he was either tweaking or terrified. "You lost, son?" she asked, setting down her mug. Zeus, sprawled under her desk, opened one eye. I found something," the kid stammered. "At the old orphanage, Oak Ridge House. I didn't know it was a crime scene or whatever. I was just taking pictures." Grace raised a brow. Urban explorers weren't new. The town had a graveyard of forgotten buildings, paper mills, closed schools, barns left to rot. But Oak Ridge House was different. It had been boarded up since 1982 after a gas leak supposedly caused an emergency evacuation. No one had lived there since. No one talked about it either. "What's your name?" "Eli," he mumbled, unzipping his pack. "You need to see this." He slid a thick manila folder across the desk. Zeus stood now, his nose twitching. Grace opened the folder slowly, eyes scanning over the first photo. A concrete room, metal beds bolted to the ground, leather restraints, a child-sized shoe in the corner. The photo had been taken with a flash, every edge sharp, every shadow harsh. Her skin went cold. "Where exactly did you take these?" "Basement," Eli said, voice cracking. "East wing. There was a wall that looked normal, but the mortar was newer. I broke through and there's a whole room back there. And names scratched into the concrete." Grace didn't hesitate. She looked down at Zeus. "Let's go." Oak Ridge House sat 3 miles north of town, off a road that used to matter. Time hadn't been kind to the building, its red bricks now green with moss, windows long boarded up or shattered. Grace pulled up beside the rusted gate. The chain link had been peeled open just enough for someone to slip through. Zeus didn't wait. He leapt from the passenger seat and padded ahead, nose to the wind, tail stiff. Grace followed, flashlight and service pistol holstered. Her boots crunched through dead leaves. It wasn't fear that curled her gut. It was memory, an itch in her bones she didn't know how to name. Eli led them through a side door pried off its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with mold, old paper, and something far worse, silence that had weight. "This way," Eli said, stepping carefully across warped linoleum. Children's drawings still clung to a hallway bulletin board. A crayon sun, a stick figure family, a red house with smoke curling from its chimney. Zeus sniffed the air and growled low. They reached the basement stairs, wooden, creaking, steep. Eli descended first, flashlight sweeping. Grace followed, and Zeus padded close behind. The basement was a maze of forgotten rooms. Filing cabinets spilled open like gutted fish. A tricycle lay overturned. A baby doll's eye stared from the corner. "Here," Eli whispered, stopping at a concrete wall. He pointed to the mortar line. Grace examined it, then nodded. "Step back." Zeus crouched low, nose pressed to the ground. Grace pressed her palm to the wall and pushed. It gave slightly. "I pried that loose last night," Eli said. "See the hole?" She crouched. A square, maybe 3 feet wide, had been broken through. Beyond it, blackness. And cold. Grace ducked inside first, flashlight sweeping across the cramped space. What she saw would stay with her forever. If you're just joining us, make sure to subscribe to Heroes for Animals on YouTube, where we honor the loyalty, instincts, and untold bravery of real animal heroes like Zeus, because sometimes they see what we can't. The hidden room was 12 feet wide, maybe 15 long. No windows, no exit, but the hole they'd crawled through. Along one wall were rusted shelves of medical supplies, syringes, glass bottles, cloth restraints. The opposite wall bore something worse. Names, dozens of them, carved by hand into concrete. Underneath, in shaky scrawl, they told us we were sick. We weren't sick. Help us. Grace's throat tightened. Zeus growled, ears back, body tense. Eli stepped forward, hands shaking. "I didn't touch anything else. I swear." Grace raised her flashlight toward the far wall. A Polaroid taped near the corner fluttered in the draft. She peeled it off slowly. A young girl, maybe 7, blonde hair, hollow eyes. A paper tag on her shirt. Patient 041. "She has a name," Grace whispered. Zeus let out a low whine and sniffed along the base of the far wall. "Something else is here," Grace murmured. Zeus barked once and began pawing at a corner. Grace knelt beside him. The concrete had crumbled slightly. Behind it, wrapped in waxed paper, was a bundle of old documents sealed with medical tape. Inside, photocopies of evaluations, handwritten notes, and one file labeled M47, a baby, male, born February 15, 1982, declared dead 3 days later. But under cause of death, a note was scribbled in different handwriting. "Transfer complete. Subject alive. Facility 7. Grace stood abruptly, heart pounding. Facility 7. She'd never heard of it. But Zeus had found the file, and her gut told her this was just the beginning. Above them, a floorboard creaked. Then a door slammed. Zeus snarled. Grace drew her weapon. "We're not alone." The echo of the door slamming upstairs hung in the silence like a warning shot. Grace froze, one hand on her service weapon, her other gripping the manila folder labeled M47. Zeus stood perfectly still, hackles raised, head tilted slightly toward the sound. Did you lock the door behind us?" Eli whispered. "No," Grace said flatly. "I didn't think we'd need to." Her voice was calm, but every cell in her body was alert now. Something was wrong. Someone else was in the building, and they didn't want this room discovered. Zeus let out a low growl, pacing a slow circle near the hole they'd crawled through. His nose was twitching hard. There was a scent in the air, fresh, human, and close. Grace made her decision fast. "Grab what you can. Photos, anything that looks like evidence. We're not going back out the way we came. There's another way." Eli didn't argue. He began scooping up documents and stuffing them into his backpack with shaking hands. Zeus led them toward a metal grate in the far wall, half hidden behind a rotted shelf. Grace gave it a push. It creaked open just enough to reveal a narrow tunnel lined with cobwebs and rusted piping. "What is this?" Eli asked. "Maintenance tunnel," Grace replied. "Probably led to the generator room or the old kitchen. You see them a lot in buildings this old." Eli stared into the blackness. "Are we sure it doesn't lead straight to hell?" Zeus didn't wait for the answer. He dove in, tail low, body tense. Grace followed. Eli cursed softly, but crawled after her. The tunnel stank of mildew and stale air. Their flashlight beams cut through the gloom in shaky cones of light. The only sound was the slosh of their boots against puddles and the occasional scurry of rats that Zeus ignored completely. It took 10 slow minutes of crawling before they reached a rusted door at the end of the shaft. Grace braced herself and shoved it open. They emerged behind Oak Ridge House, just past what used to be a playground. Rusted swings creaked in the wind. A jungle gym twisted into a skeleton of its former self. The trees whispered, their orange leaves drifting down like burnt memories. Zeus sniffed the wind, then barked once toward the forest. "Someone was watching us," Grace said, scanning the tree line. "And they didn't come in just to scare us. They wanted to lock us in." Eli looked pale. "You think they were going to kill us?" "I think they were going to let the building do the work." She pulled out her radio, adjusting the frequency. "This is Deputy Grace Lawson. We need immediate backup at Oak Ridge House. Suspected intrusion. Basement access has been compromised. Possible evidence tampering. Respond, code 3. She waited. Nothing. Static hissed from the radio speaker. "No signal," she muttered. "They're jamming it, or we're too far out." Eli stared at the manila folder in her hand. "What does it mean? Facility 7. Grace shook her head slowly. "I don't know. But it's not just a name. It's a code for something buried. Something someone still wants hidden." Zeus barked again, urgent this time. He darted toward the playground and stopped at the base of a tree, pawing at the dirt. Grace followed, kneeling beside him. She brushed away a layer of leaves and uncovered a rusted metal box. She pried it open with her utility knife. Inside, Polaroids. Dozens of them. Each photo showed a child. Different ages, different races, but each wore the same terrified look and a paper tag with a number pinned to their shirt. Below the photos were handwritten notes. Subject 022, transferred. Subject 014, processed. Subject 031, rejected, terminate. "Jesus," Eli whispered. They were cataloging them like livestock. Grace felt her hands start to tremble. This wasn't just about neglect. It was systemic, deliberate. A machine built to sort children by some invisible metric and erase the ones who didn't fit. Zeus gave a short huff and looked up at her as if saying, "You know this isn't over." "No," Grace whispered, eyes locked on the notes. "This is just the start." They returned to town just after dark, parking behind the sheriff's station to avoid attention. Grace brought Zeus and Eli through the back door and into the evidence room. She locked the door behind them and set everything on the table. Documents, photos. The M47 files. She scanned the notes again. There it was, in tiny, faded script. Patient M47, born 2/15/82. Male, healthy, transferred to F7 per Dr. M. Price's authorization. Dr. M. Price. The name hit Grace like a hammer. Dr. Malcolm Price had been a fixture in Oak Ridge for decades. Retired now, but once the director of the county health board. A friendly face in every newspaper clipping. He still lived up in Hollow Pines retirement community, just 15 minutes away. "You know him?" Eli asked. "Everyone knows him," Grace said. "He ran free dental clinics, sponsored scholarships. He even donated to the dog park." Zeus looked up at her at the sound of dog park. "Of course he did," she muttered. Hollow Pines looked like a postcard. Neatly trimmed hedges, American flags on every porch. Golf carts parked like trophies. Grace pulled into the visitor lot and left Zeus in the back seat with the windows cracked. Eli stayed behind. "I'm coming back," she promised him. "But if I'm not back in 20, call Deputy Martin and tell him to meet you here." "What if I can't reach him either?" Eli asked. "Then you run," she said, "and don't stop." She knocked on Unit 12, and a moment later, the door opened. Dr. Malcolm Price looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, thin, neatly dressed. He wore a cardigan over a dress shirt and slacks. His silver hair was combed straight back. "Deputy Lawson," he said warmly. "What a pleasant surprise." "Evening, Dr. Price. Mind if I ask you a few questions about Oak Ridge House?" His smile faltered for just a second. "That was a long time ago." "Yes, sir. But it seems the past is waking up." She stepped inside when he motioned. The interior was pristine. Leather-bound books lined the shelves. A framed certificate from Johns Hopkins hung behind his desk. "Tea?" he offered. She shook her head. "No, thank you." "Then ask your questions." Grace laid the M47 file on the coffee table. Dr. Price's hand twitched. "I found this under Oak Ridge," she said, "with about 40 others." He stared at it for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "So they're still there?" Grace stiffened. "What do you mean, still there?" "I thought it was all gone," he murmured. "Burned, buried. All these years I told myself it was better that way." "Tell me what Facility 7 is." Price looked up at her. His eyes were clearer now, harder. "Facility 7 was never a place, Deputy. It was a program, a sorting system." He stood slowly, walked over to the fireplace, and took down a book. He opened it. Inside, a stack of faded documents. "Insurance," he said, "in case someone like you ever came knocking." Grace scanned the pages. Transfers, lab reports, names, children. "Why, she asked. "Why would you do this?" Price lowered himself back into his chair like an old man carrying too much weight. "The state paid more for children with psychiatric needs. We learned to identify symptoms, enhance behaviors. The right diagnosis unlocked funding." "You falsified records," she said coldly. "Labeled healthy kids as sick." "We saved them," he said sharply. "We gave them structure, clean beds, medication. We were improving lives. You were trafficking children." He didn't deny it. Grace leaned forward. "Where are they now?" His eyes didn't waver. "I don't know, but if you've found M47, he might." "Who is he?" Price gave a ghost of a smile. "He was the smartest one. Escaped reclassification 3 times. Always asking questions. Always drawing maps." He closed his eyes. "I think he's still alive. And if you find him, be gentle. The world never was." Back in the cruiser, Grace sat in silence, staring at the folder in her hands. Zeus rested his chin on the seat beside her. She reached over and scratched behind his ears. "Come on, partner," she said. "We're not done yet." Zeus wagged his tail once. In the glove box, her recorder blinked red, still running from earlier. And on the seat beside her, a photo of a man in his 30s with the tag M47 pinned to his shirt. He was looking at the camera, but it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They looked like her mother's. They said no one ever left Facility 7, but someone had, and Grace was staring at him. The old photograph was grainy, yellowed at the corners. Subject M47 sat upright in a bare hospital room, early 30s, clean-cut hair, blank expression. No name, no smile, just a number pinned to his gray shirt and a faraway look in his eyes, like the soul inside him had gone wandering and never come back. Grace sat in her cruiser outside Hollow Pines for a long time that night, Zeus curled up beside her, head on her lap. The envelope Dr. Price had given her rested on the dash, filled with transfer records, facility codes, and one organizational chart that made her stomach twist into knots. Dozens of institutions, psychiatric wings, behavioral study labs, a spiderweb of names and acronyms stretching across 3 states, but always circling back to one origin point: Oak Ridge House for Children. Zeus lifted his head and gave a low huff. "I know," Grace whispered, rubbing behind his ears. "It's not over." The next morning, Grace sat across from her boss, Sheriff Amos Schmeckett, in his cluttered office. The blinds were halfway open, letting in weak October light. "You're saying kids were trafficked through that orphanage?" Beckett said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "That medical staff faked records, got government funding, and then shipped these kids off to some kind of black site research labs?" "Yes, sir." "And you've got the documents?" "Some of them. Enough to start kicking up noise. But we need to move fast. The more people know, the more the wrong people start disappearing things." Zeus sat by the door, eyes locked on the hallway. "And this M47, he's still alive?" Beckett asked. "I think so," Grace said. "But if they find out we're looking for him—" Beckett sighed, leaned back in his chair, and gave her a long, searching look. You really think you're ready for where this goes? Grace didn't blink. He might be my brother. Beckett didn't ask how she knew. He just nodded. Then go get him. Zeus rode shotgun again, ears perked as they headed north on Route 17, following the trail left in Dr. Price's documents. One location stood out: Pine Haven Center, a private psychiatric facility decommissioned in 1995 after a quiet investigation into patient neglect. But in the margins of the transfer logs, someone had scribbled a note. Facility 7 assets relocated. Contact R. Vesper, Building C, Room 241. Zeus gave a soft growl as they passed the rusted Pine Haven sign. The building looked abandoned. Faded brick, boarded windows, weeds eating the parking lot. But the camera mounted above the entrance was modern. Too modern. Grace pulled around back, parked behind a delivery van, and stepped out slowly. Zeus didn't move. You smell it, don't you? She murmured. Something was wrong. There was no wind, no birds. The air felt too still. Grace approached the side door, checked the rusted keypad, and sighed. No chance. But Zeus nosed the corner, pawed once, then turned to the dumpster. A gap, just wide enough to crawl. You serious? She muttered. Zeus was already halfway in. Inside, the place smelled like bleach and dust. The hallways were clean, polished. Not what she'd expected from a condemned building. But the lights were on. Grace moved carefully through the hallways, following Zeus. The facility was shaped like a U, with the main corridor looping into two long wings. Room numbers were painted directly onto the doors, 240s on the far side. Zeus stopped in front of room 241. Grace's pulse kicked up. She knocked gently. No response. She turned the knob. Inside sat a man at a small metal table, sketching quietly on lined paper. His hair was dark, short, a little uneven. He looked up as the door creaked, and Grace felt her breath catch. His eyes were gray, her mother's eyes. Michael, she said softly. The man blinked. I don't have a name, he said, but they call me 47. Michael wasn't wild or violent. He was quiet, measured, too calm for someone who had lived 30 years in institutional silence. Grace sat across from him while Zeus lay at his feet, tail wagging slowly. Michael stared at the dog like he didn't quite believe he was real. They told us animals didn't exist anymore, he said, that the world outside was empty, dried up. Grace felt the tightness in her chest again. What else did they tell you? That we were dangerous, that we were born wrong, that our parents didn't want us. Grace showed him the photo of himself as a baby, the paper tag, the time stamp. You were born in Oak Ridge, she said. My mom was there. She went into early labor. They told her the baby died. Michael touched the edge of the photo like it might burn him. I remember singing, he whispered. A woman sang to me, not the nurses. Softer, real. Grace swallowed hard. She still sings, she said, at church every Sunday. For the first time, Michael smiled. It was small, unsteady, but it was there. Then came the crash, the sound of metal slamming, voices shouting, boots stomping through the hallway. Michael's eyes widened. They found us. Grace jumped to her feet, pulling Michael up. Zeus was already moving. Where's the back way out? She asked. Michael blinked. There's a service tunnel. I mapped it. Show me. They sprinted down the corridor as doors began slamming behind them. Grace could hear men barking orders, radios crackling. Michael led them through the laundry area and into a supply room. He kicked aside a loose tile and pulled up a metal grate. Zeus dove in first. Grace shoved Michael after him and slid in last, heart hammering. Behind them, the door burst open. Gunshots cracked. Concrete dust rained down. They crawled. The service tunnel ran beneath the facility, barely tall enough to crouch. Water dripped from overhead pipes. Zeus led the way, his paws silent against the concrete. After 10 minutes, they reached a hatch. Grace pushed it open and climbed out into fresh air. They were behind the old staff building, half a mile from the main entrance. Michael sat on the grass, eyes wide, staring at the sky. "I thought it would be darker," he whispered. "But it's blue." "Yeah," Grace said, watching him. "It's always been blue." Zeus flopped beside them, tongue lolling, chest heaving. Grace reached for her radio. "This is Deputy Lawson. I have one subject in protective custody. Immediate extraction required. Officers may be compromised. Use caution." A pause, then a crackle. "Copy, Lawson. You've got backup inbound." 2 hours later, back at the station, Michael sat wrapped in a blanket in Grace's office. He sipped from a cup of warm apple cider. Zeus lay at his feet like a furry shadow. "You're safe now," Grace told him. He nodded. "But the others aren't." Grace looked up sharply. "What others?" Michael pointed to the map he'd drawn. "There are 26 more," he said, "still in Facility 7. Grace's jaw tightened. "Where?" He hesitated. Then he whispered, "Under Building C, in the Black Wing. They don't talk. They don't move much. But they're still alive." Grace's voice dropped. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Michael's eyes found hers. "Because I didn't know if I could trust you." Zeus nudged his hand. Michael smiled again, bigger this time. "I trust him." It was the kind of cold that clung to your skin, even in full sunlight. The kind of cold that didn't come from the air, but from knowing you were about to walk into something that could change you forever. Deputy Grace Lawson had faced meth labs, hostage standoffs, and backwoods shootouts in her 10 years on the force. But none of those had ever made her hands shake like this. The map Michael had drawn wasn't fancy, just pencil on legal pad. But it was precise. Labeled corridors, air vents, hidden access points. He remembered everything. 30 years inside a facility designed to erase people hadn't dulled his memory. In fact, it might have made it sharper. Grace looked across the table at him as he sat wrapped in his county-issued fleece blanket, sipping weak coffee. "They keep them in the Black Wing," he said softly. "Below Building C. There's no windows, no sound, just long halls and numbered doors." "Numbered like your old room?" she asked. Michael nodded. "Exactly like mine. But those rooms, they don't open from the inside. And most of the people inside haven't talked in years. Some since they were kids." Grace leaned forward. "How many?" 26, he said. "But there used to be more." He wouldn't say how many more meant. Zeus stirred beneath the table, sensing the tension in Michael's voice. He scooted closer and pressed his head against Michael's leg. Michael smiled faintly and reached down to stroke the fur between the dog's ears. Grace cleared her throat. "We're going back tonight." Michael looked up quickly. "You can't go alone." "I won't," she said. "Sheriff Beckett's authorizing a quiet task force. Just 2 of us going in plain clothes. No flashing lights, no noise. We get those people out before anyone knows we're there." Michael swallowed. "Then you'll need a way in." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a chipped plastic badge. The kind that beeped doors open and turned heads the other way. "I took this the day I escaped." Zeus let out a low, approving grunt. "At 2:13 tonight?" Grace, Zeus, and Deputy Lucas Rayner parked along a fire road a quarter-mile behind Pine Haven's utility wing. No marked units, no radios, just night vision goggles, 2 suppressed handguns, and a harnessed German shepherd who could track human scent like it was perfume. Michael stayed back with a tactical medic, monitored remotely. His pulse was steady. Too steady. "You sure you're good for this?" Rayner asked, checking his gear. "I'm not the one who needs saving," Grace said. They crouched low and moved fast. Zeus in the lead, nose to the ground, tail stiff. The trees opened into the forgotten edge of the campus, where vines had choked the walls, but the sidewalk was still clear. Building C looked like every other structure. Faded sign, boarded windows, fake abandonment. But when Grace pressed the access badge against the side panel, The electronic lock clicked like it was 1992 all over again. They were in. Inside, the air was thick with ammonia and silence. Zeus paused every few steps to sniff. No barking, just quiet. Focused. The hallway lights were dimmed, the kind used in hospitals at night. There were signs on the walls, but the arrows pointed nowhere. Grace counted rooms as they passed. The numbers skipped every other door. Some rooms had no numbers at all. She looked back at Rayner. Feel that? He nodded. Feels like we're in a coffin. At the far end, they found it. Room 237. It had no nameplate, no peephole, just a slot, waist height, where food trays might slide through. Grace signaled Zeus to stay close, then swiped the card. The lock disengaged with a dull thud. She opened the door slowly. Inside sat a woman, maybe 50, on the edge of a cot. Her hair was matted, her skin pale. She stared straight ahead, but didn't react to the intrusion. There was no TV, no light, but a single overhead bulb. No sounds until Zeus stepped forward. The woman looked down and smiled. "A dog," she whispered. It was the first thing she'd said in years. "Chanti, petitsa." They moved fast after that. Reiner began unlocking doors while Grace swept the halls. Zeus followed scent trails. In every room they opened, they found people. Some young, some old, some too thin, some blank-eyed. Most didn't speak, but they came willingly. In room 245, a boy no older than 12 held a stuffed animal so tight it looked like it was part of his arm. In room 249, a woman clutched an old cassette tape labeled "Lullaby Mom." In room 251, Zeus refused to enter. Grace stepped inside and gagged. The bed was empty, but the walls were covered in scratches. Names, dates. A final word repeated over and over. "Help!" she radioed quietly. "Rayner, we've got something ugly in 251. Document it. Don't let anyone else see this yet. Copy!" By 3:00 a.m., they had 23 people assembled in the old recreation hall. Most hadn't spoken. All wore the same slate-gray uniform. No labels, no IDs. But Zeus sat among them like a guardian. The youngest girl, maybe 7, crawled into his lap and fell asleep there. Grace stared at them. "This was never about research," she whispered. "This was about control." Rayner stepped beside her. 3 rooms locked from the outside, doors welded shut. Grace exhaled hard. "Any names?" "Only initials etched into the concrete, but no records." She looked down at the child sleeping against Zeus. "Well, then we're their records now." Japai. Extraction began at 3:22 a.m. 4 unmarked ambulances arrived quietly, followed by a black SUV with 2 federal agents. One's Sheriff Beckett trusted enough to bring in. They loaded the survivors gently. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just silence and professionalism. Michael waited at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed. When one of the older survivors, room 237, stepped off the van and saw him, she stopped. "Michael?" He blinked. "Clarissa," he breathed. She ran to him, wrapped her arms around him, and sobbed. Michael didn't cry, but Zeus, standing next to them, gave a sharp, proud bark. Later that morning, as the sun broke over Pine Haven for the first time in decades, Grace stood outside the facility with her hands on her hips. Reiner walked up, sipping lukewarm coffee. "You know," he said, "we've got 26 survivors, but no answers, no names, no one on the books. If they weren't here legally, this operation technically never existed." Grace nodded. "That's why it's our job to make it exist now." Reiner raised a brow. "You think the higher-ups are going to let that happen?" She pointed to Zeus, curled up in the grass beside 2 kids eating peanut butter crackers from the emergency rations. "That dog found more truth than the last 3 administrations combined. They can't silence that." Reiner looked around. "What if this goes deeper than we thought?" Grace exhaled. "Then we keep digging." Back at the station, Grace sat across from Sheriff Beckett and slid a thick folder across his desk. "Names," she said. "What we've got. Matching initials, old records, patient files, cross-checked handwriting samples. It's enough to open a case. Beckett flipped through it. You sure about this?
If we don't speak for them, no one will.
He nodded slowly. Then I guess it's time we go public. Grace leaned back in her chair. Zeus, lying nearby, gave a satisfied sigh. But somewhere deep down, she knew the worst wasn't over. Not until they found out who was funding Facility 7. And what happened to the others who didn't make it to room 237. The survivors didn't talk much. They ate. They slept. They sat under the fluorescent lights of the emergency shelter with that same hollow-eyed stare, like people who'd lived in darkness so long that daylight didn't seem real. Deputy Grace Lawson walked the rows of cots one more time, clipboard in hand, trying to catalog what the state wouldn't admit existed. 26 names, except they didn't have names. Just initials, just numbers. And the one word scribbled into most of their original files, F7. Zeus padded beside her quietly, pausing here and there to let a child stroke his back or to rest his head on an old man's knee. Somehow, the people trusted him more than anyone else. Maybe that's because he didn't ask questions. He just stayed. That morning, Grace sat with Sheriff Beckett and a team of social workers at the County Emergency Center. The map of Oregon behind them was covered in red thumbtacks. Each tack marked a transfer, a known facility, or a point of disappearance. What do you know about something called Code F7? She asked the lead state rep, a suit named Calvin Rowe, who looked like he'd never missed a golf tournament in his life. He stiffened. I'm not at liberty to, Try again. Rowe shifted uncomfortably. F7 was a categorization flag used internally during the late 70s through mid-90s. It stood for Facility Class 7, originally tied to behavioral case studies. Children marked with F7 were often transferred to state-sponsored psychological research programs. Research programs? Grace echoed. They were supposed to be temporary placements, evaluations, therapy trials, development, tracking. And if the child didn't match the outcome, Rowe looked down. They were reassigned. Grace leaned forward. Reassigned where? That's the problem, he admitted. Most of the facilities weren't public. Some were privately funded, and some were tied to defense contracts. Rayner, standing beside her, let out a low whistle. You're telling me the state shipped kids to defense-funded institutions for therapy? Rowe's voice dropped. Not therapy, behavioral conditioning, response testing, isolation, durability. They were trying to crack patterns in early cognitive control, how to break will, how to rebuild identity. And you just let it happen? Grace asked. I was in high school when this started, he snapped. But the people behind it? They were the kind of folks who got buildings named after them. Endowments, awards. No one wanted to look too closely. Well, we're looking now, Grace said. Zeus gave a short bark, as if in agreement. Later that afternoon, Grace met with Michael again. He was sitting on the back porch of the sheriff's station, watching cars go by. The fall leaves blew across the asphalt in gold and orange spirals. Zeus sat beside him, chin on Michael's knee. You okay? Grace asked, handing him a cup of cider. Michael nodded. Better than I've ever been. He didn't say it like a joke. Grace sat next to him. I've been reading those files. You remembered every room, every door, even the vents. That's how you survived, isn't it? Michael nodded slowly. I told myself if I couldn't leave, I'd learn everything. Every crack, every code, every guard rotation. I mapped it all in my head for years. Grace hesitated. You know it's not over, right? Michael didn't look surprised. They're going to come for the others, or cover their tracks. They already are, Grace said. Clarissa, the woman from room 237, she's gone. Left the medical shelter last night. No note, no signature, just vanished. Michael's hands tightened around the cup. She wouldn't leave, not by choice. We checked cameras, blank after midnight. She was taken. Zeus growled softly, almost a whisper. Grace nodded. We think so too. Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out another sketch, this one rougher than the others. It showed a large facility, broken into 5 wings. Each wing had different markers: C for control, O for observation, M for medical, and one labeled, "What's P?" she asked. Michael hesitated. Processing. That night, Grace and Rayner returned to Pine Haven, this time with a court order, a forensics team, and a pair of federal agents who didn't seem entirely sure who they worked for. Building C was still locked, still lit, still humming like a working facility. But the Black Wing, empty, every room scrubbed, floors bleached, surveillance drives removed. Not a single paper document remained. "You sure this was it?" one of the agents asked. Grace pointed to the scratch marks Zeus had found earlier, barely visible under new paint. "Help!" "Yeah," she said, "I'm sure." Zeus barked twice and darted down the hall, nose to the floor. They followed. Halfway down, he stopped at a side utility door. Grace jiggled the handle. Locked. Rayner kicked it open. Inside, a narrow hallway leading to a concrete stairwell. "Was this on Michael's map?" Rayner asked. Grace nodded. It led to the sub-basement. They descended slowly. At the bottom, another locked door. And another. And then, an old filing room. Zeus stepped in first, paws crunching on a layer of glass. Every cabinet had been smashed open. Files burned in metal bins. Hard drives doused in bleach. But in the corner, under a metal desk, Zeus pawed something loose. Grace knelt. It was a small tape recorder. She hit play. Static. Then a voice. Michael's voice. "If you're hearing this, it means you found it. Or what's left of it." They were called the Children of Code F7. "We never had birthdays, never saw the sun. We weren't people. We were trials. But we remembered. We told each other stories, whispered names through the vents, scratched messages into stone. So if you're out there now, and you were one of us, know this. We're free, and they can't hide us anymore." The tape clicked off. Zeus whined and laid his head on Grace's boot. Rayner stared at her. He knew this would happen. Grace nodded, jaw tight. He planned for it. The next morning, Grace sat on the courthouse steps with Michael beside her, looking out at the crowd. Reporters swarmed the lawn. Survivors stood together for the first time in public. The Department of Justice had arrived overnight. An investigation was underway. Congressional hearings were being drafted. But the ones who started it all? Still unnamed? Still hidden. "You think we'll ever find them?" Michael asked. Grace watched the sky. "I think they're watching us right now." He looked down at Zeus, who lay stretched across the steps like a silent sentry. "But I also think they're scared," she said, "because now they know something they didn't expect." "What's that?" Grace smiled. "They didn't break you." Michael didn't respond. He didn't need to. Zeus lifted his head and let out a soft, proud bark. And behind them, the courthouse doors opened. It was time to speak. The courtroom was packed. Not with reporters or politicians or even the curious public, but with survivors. 23 of them sat shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, all wearing donated clothes and quiet determination. Some held hands. A few wore headphones connected to calming music. All of them had the same look in their eyes. They were ready to be heard. Deputy Grace Lawson stood near the front, not in uniform, but wearing a plain gray jacket and black slacks. Beside her sat Michael, his posture tense but proud, a small name tag clipped to his collar. Michael Garrett, former F7 resident. He had a name now, and he wasn't hiding. Zeus lay curled between them, calm but alert, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Cameras were barred from the chamber, but the story was already out. The Children of Code F7 had become a national conversation. What Grace never expected was how many others would start speaking up. 3 days after the first press release, a woman in Des Moines came forward. Then a man in Tucson, a nurse from Seattle, an orderly from Vermont. One by one, the names of old facilities began resurfacing. Oak Ridge had been the center, but it wasn't alone. It was part of a network, and facility CABI DEC. only one node in a long, shadowy chain. Grace sat with federal investigators mapping the connections using Michael's sketches, Dr. Price's documents, and newly submitted whistleblower files. The scope of it all was staggering. Dozens of children moved across state lines, names changed, deaths faked, entire childhoods erased for what one report called non-consensual developmental evaluation. Some of it had been funded through federal grants hidden under research budgets. Some through private institutions claiming to rehabilitate troubled youth. But the worst part, it had worked. At least from a system perspective. People made money, studies were published, careers were built, and kids, well, they disappeared. Until now. A week later, Grace stood in front of the marble wall at the State Memorial Plaza. It had once been a blank stone facade. Now it bore 26 names. The names had been etched based on file recoveries, first-hand memories, and patient tags. Not all were complete. Some still had missing last names, some only had initials. But they were there. A crowd gathered for the dedication. Local officials, national leaders, survivors, community members. And Zeus, he sat proudly at Grace's feet, his K9 vest newly embroidered with the words, "For the Forgotten." The governor stepped up to the podium and tapped the mic. "This wall isn't just a memorial. It's a promise," he said. "That those who were silenced will be heard, that those who were hidden will be seen, and that the names carved into this stone are just the beginning." Grace didn't hear the rest of the speech. She was watching Michael. He stood off to the side, tracing the first name on the wall with his finger. Subject 001, Lila A. He didn't know her, but he remembered her humming through the vents. Later that night, the sheriff's office felt quieter than usual. Grace sat at her desk, reviewing the final case file, now labeled Operation Grey Hollow Status, Closed, Pending Prosecution. There were warrants now, arrests, congressional hearings on the books, names in headlines that used to sit behind desks in private hospitals. Justice, in its long, uneven way, had begun. But Grace knew justice wasn't the whole story. Healing was slower. Michael had started therapy with a specialist who focused on institutional trauma. He still flinched at loud noises, still slept with the lights on. But he laughed now. He had preferences. Chili over soup, mountains over beaches, jazz over country. He even signed up for GED classes. And Zeus? He stuck close, always by Michael's side, unless Grace called him back. The two had formed a bond that needed no words. When Michael got overwhelmed, Zeus laid his head on his lap. When he had nightmares, Zeus scratched at his door until Michael opened it. One survivor told Grace, "That dog sees the ghosts before we do." Maybe that was true. The last item on Grace's desk was an envelope. No return address. Inside, a single photograph. A child, no older than 5, with a paper tag that read F7059. And a note. "I remember my name now. Thank you, Elena." Grace smiled. Zeus let out a quiet woof beside her. She turned to him. "Think we're done?" Zeus stood, stretched, and walked to the door. Then he stopped, tilted his head, like he'd heard something she hadn't. She rose and grabbed her jacket. "All right, partner, let's go." Because the truth was, there were probably more children out there. More survivors. More names still stuck in the dark, waiting to be pulled into the light. The next day, Grace walked with Michael to the town's elementary school. Not to enroll him, but to meet with the principal, who'd offered space for a weekly survivor support group. Michael would co-lead it with Clarissa, who had been safely recovered 2 days earlier in a nearby town. "Are you nervous?" Grace asked. Michael nodded. "Kind of." "You don't have to be." He looked at her. "Why not?" She smiled. "Because for the first time, the people in that room will know your name." That night, Grace uploaded a special video to the Sheriff's Department channel and cross-posted it to the Heroes for Animals YouTube page. The thumbnail showed Zeus sitting at the memorial wall, the 26 names glowing in golden sunlight behind him. Grace's voice? Grace's voice narrated over the footage. This is Zeus. He didn't just track scent, he found history. He found truth. He found people the world forgot. We share this story not for sympathy, but for action. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from courtrooms. Sometimes it comes from the steady heart of a dog who refuses to look away. As the video ended, Grace sat with Michael on the station steps, watching the comments roll in. Thousands of them, from every state. Some said thank you. Some said, I think I was there too. Some asked, how can I help? Michael turned to her, his expression softer than she had ever seen. You think we'll find the rest? Grace didn't answer right away. Zeus rested his head on Michael's foot. She watched them for a moment, then said, if we keep listening, really listening, we will. Thank you for joining us on this journey. This story was inspired by real canine heroes and the silent strength of those who refuse to be forgotten. Now, we'd like to hear from you. If you had one chance to speak for someone who couldn't speak for themselves, who would it be? And why? Let us know in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Heroes for Animals to support more stories like this one. Sometimes, the best way to shine a light in the dark is to follow the dog who never stops searching. Good night and take care.